The coffee pot hissed softly behind the counter, steam curling toward the ceiling like a lazy ghost. Morning sunlight slanted through the front windows of Bayview Diner, washing the red vinyl booths in golden light and flickering off the chrome napkin holders. It was the kind of place where people knew your name and your order, where peace had its own rhythm. But that morning, something darker walked in behind the light. The bell over the door clanged harder than it should have. 3 men strutted in like they owned the world, Glenn with the swagger, Ty with the sneer, and Rick trailing behind, quiet but watching everything. Loud, laughing, and way too early for beer breath and trouble. Eyes followed them but quickly turned away. Even the fry cook stopped whistling. At the center of it all was Sarah Miller. 25. Tired. Tough in the ways that don't show on the outside. She'd been working back-to-back shifts to cover her father's medical bills. Woke up early, wore a smile she didn't feel, and poured coffee for people who barely looked up. She'd dealt with rude before. But today? This was different. They picked her. Glenn made a joke about her apron. Ty let his hand linger too long when she passed. Rick knocked a fork off the table and smirked when she bent to pick it up. Then Glenn reached out, grabbed her wrist, just a little too tight, just a little too long, and whispered something foul that made her stomach twist. The customers didn't move. One man lifted his phone, but didn't record. Sarah stood there, cheeks burning, coffee pot trembling in her grip. This wasn't just harassment. It was humiliation. She wasn't scared, not exactly. Just tired. So tired of being the one people pushed around because they knew she wouldn't fight back. The laughter at the booth behind her got louder. Her ears burned. Her eyes stung. She felt invisible again, except when someone wanted to make her feel small. And just when she thought she might break, when she wondered if anyone in the world still believed in doing the right thing, the bell above the diner door jingled again. The man who walked in wasn't loud. He didn't need to be. Admiral Robert James, in full navy whites, ribbons lined in careful rows, his posture straighter than steel, stepped into the room like a tide rolling in. 2 officers followed behind him, silent and sharp. And in that instant, everything changed. Before we continue, like this video and comment where you're watching from. Your support helps us bring more exciting stories that you won't want to miss. The room shifted as Admiral James stepped through the doorway, but it hadn't shifted enough to stop what had already begun. Glenn's fingers were still curled around Sarah's wrist, his touch uninvited, his grip far too familiar. Ty leaned back in the booth with his boots up on the opposite bench, laughing like it was a TV show made just for him. Rick, quiet and unreadable, flicked his eyes toward the Admiral and then back to Sarah, as if gauging how long the game could continue before it got too dangerous. But Glenn, he hadn't noticed anything yet. Or he had, and simply didn't care. Sarah stiffened as Glenn's breath hit her ear, sour and close. "You always this jumpy, sweetheart," he murmured, giving her wrist a little tug. Her pulse thudded in her ears, the coffee pot shaking in her other hand. "I bet you're real sweet when you're not working, huh?" Ty hooted, thumping the table with the flat of his palm. A spoon rattled on the formica surface. Across the diner, the regulars kept their eyes on their food like it was the most fascinating meal they'd ever had. The man with the phone held it low, camera aimed but screen dark, uncertain whether to film or to flee. Mr. Kaplan, the diner's owner, had stepped into the back just minutes earlier, leaving Sarah with no backup. The other waitress hadn't clocked in yet. Even the jukebox, stuck on silent for years, felt like it was holding its breath. "I've got other tables," Sarah said finally, voice low and even. She didn't yank her wrist away. She eased it, slow and deliberate, like a trapped animal trying not to spook its captor. Glenn let go, but his smirk deepened. "Feisty," he said. Ty reached across and swatted her apron string playfully, but she flinched like it was a slap. Rick hadn't moved. He just stared. There was something calculating about him, less drunk, less loud, but maybe more dangerous because of it. His eyes followed every twitch of Sarah's shoulders, every movement of her legs. She turned from the table and forced herself to walk calmly back toward the counter, pretending her hands weren't shaking. At the coffee station, she let out a shaky breath and braced her hand against the wall. Her fingers brushed the side of the metal urn. It was hotter than she realized. A sharp sting raced up her palm as she pulled her hand back, skin reddening instantly. She hissed under her breath and cradled her hand, teeth clenched as she blinked hard, willing the tears to stay down. No one saw it or pretended they didn't. Pain was one thing. Humiliation was another. "Hey, waitress!" Glenn shouted from across the room, his voice slicing through the false calm. "You forget about us already? Or is that burn on your hand an excuse to slack off?" The laughter rolled in waves from the booth. Ty leaned into the aisle and pantomimed wiping a tear. Rick finally cracked a smile. Sarah turned, holding the notepad in one hand, her injured one tucked behind her back. "Be right with you," she said tightly. She picked up a tray, balancing it carefully. Her wrist ached, but she moved anyway, because what else was she supposed to do? She had rent due in 4 days. As she neared their booth, Rick stuck out a foot. It was subtle, just enough to catch the edge of her sneaker. Her balance tipped, the tray lurched, and for a heart-stopping moment, she thought it would all go crashing down. Somehow, she caught herself. But not before the coffee sloshed over the side and splattered across the edge of the table and onto Rick's sleeve. There was a beat of silence. Then Rick stood slow, precise, and looked at the stain on his arm. "You think this is funny?" he said. His voice was calm, but the stillness in him made her stomach knot. Sarah stepped back. "It was an accident," she said quickly. "You stuck your foot out." Glenn snorted. "What, you calling my boy a liar now?" Ty cracked his knuckles. "She's got an attitude for a waitress," he said. "Maybe someone needs to teach her some manners." The booth behind them, the one with the couple eating pancakes, got very quiet. Sarah's breath came faster, though she tried to hide it. Her burn throbbed. Her pride was bleeding. Her hands were full of adrenaline and nowhere to put it. And then Glenn stood, rising slowly, towering over her with a half-empty glass in one hand and a dangerous grin in the other. "I got a better idea," he said. "How about you pour me another one, and this time, do it with a smile?" He thrust the glass at her, the sticky rim brushing her knuckles. She stepped back, but not fast enough. He caught her wrist again, this time higher up, and held it. Not hard enough to bruise, but enough to make it clear who was in control. Sarah glanced toward the counter. No one moved. The man with the phone had lowered it now. Her heart sank. There was no cavalry coming. No rescue. Only chime. The door jingled. Light hit the floor like a spotlight. A breeze curled into the diner and carried with it the scent of sea salt and pressed fabric. Glenn didn't turn. Rick didn't move. But Sarah did. Her head snapped up, eyes wide as she saw the white of the uniform. Admiral James stepped forward, calm, unhurried. He didn't scan the room. He commanded it. Silence followed him like a shadow. Ty was the first to notice, his smirk faltering as he elbowed Glenn lightly. "Dude," he muttered. "You see who just walked in?" Rick's eyes tracked the Admiral carefully now, his smile completely gone. Glenn, still gripping Sarah's wrist, turned halfway. Sarah barely breathed. Glenn's fingers were still on her. But something was different now. The air had changed. The game had shifted. And so, when Glenn leaned in close one more time and whispered low, just loud enough for her to hear it, "What's a pretty thing like you doing here anyway?" She didn't look at him. She looked at the man in white who had just stepped through the door. And everything inside her hoped, this time, someone would actually do something. The chime above the diner door rang out again, but this time, it wasn't just a sound, it was a rupture. The kind that cut through tension like a blade through fabric. Sarah turned sharply, her breath half caught in her throat, expecting more trouble. Instead, she saw white, pristine, pressed, and gleaming beneath the morning light. The man who entered walked like the floor owed him balance. Admiral Robert James didn't shout, didn't stride, didn't scan the room like a predator, but somehow, he still drew every eye. He was tall, lean, and meticulously dressed in a Navy service uniform adorned with ribbons, medals, and years of silent battles. His hat was tucked neatly under one arm, his silver hair trimmed close, his expression unreadable but watchful. Behind him followed 2 younger officers, dressed similarly, moving in quiet step like they'd done this countless times. The The sound of their shoes against the checkered tile echoed louder than the earlier laughter. Conversations died mid-sentence. Forks froze midair. Even the booth of businessmen near the window stopped chewing, their jaws tightening as they took in the trio. The sudden stillness was unnatural, like the room itself had come to attention. Glenn's grip on Sarah slackened, just slightly enough for her to pull away without making it obvious. She stepped back, blinking fast, her chest rising with a sharp breath she hadn't meant to take. She didn't know his name yet, but the look in his eyes said everything he saw her. Not just the uniform. Not just the spill. Not just the surface. Her. Admiral James paused at the entrance, his gaze sweeping calmly across the room, not hunting, not threatening, just taking inventory. His expression didn't flinch when it passed over Glenn, Ty, and Rick. He saw them. He measured them. But it was Sarah who caught his attention, and it stayed on her half a beat longer than anything else. For a moment, Sarah thought she might cry. Her hands trembled at her sides, and her knees didn't feel like they belonged to her. But she turned away. She had to. She had a job to finish. Customers waiting. A pot of coffee cooling behind the counter. Glenn muttered something under his breath as she walked away, but the tone had shifted. There was no bark to it now, just the sputter of a man who didn't like feeling small. Ty rubbed the back of his neck and leaned sideways, as if preparing an exit strategy. Rick said nothing, his fingers drumming the table in a slow, thoughtful rhythm. Their arrogance hadn't evaporated, it was just confused. They couldn't quite tell yet if the danger had passed, or just begun. Admiral James moved with purpose, but no urgency. He approached the counter and offered a polite nod to one of the men seated nearby, who nearly stood out of reflex. "Is this table free?" the Admiral asked, his voice low, smooth, and absolute. The man nodded so quickly, he nearly knocked over his water. James slid into the booth, placing his cap gently on the table. One of his officers remained standing, scanning the room like a quiet sentry. The other sat across from him, spine straight, hands folded. It wasn't intimidation, it was discipline. It was presence. It was the kind of unspoken authority that came from doing the hard things when no one else would. From behind the counter, Sarah refilled a pitcher of water with shaking fingers. She kept her back turned just long enough to collect herself, but her thoughts raced. What was someone like him doing here? Not just someone military, someone important. You could feel it in his posture, in the way the room bent around him without his asking. She poured coffee into a chipped mug for another table and turned slowly to glance at the Admiral. He was watching her again, still calm, still unreadable. Not judgmental. Not curious. Just aware. The door opened again, and for half a second Sarah flinched, afraid another drunk had arrived. But it was just Mr. Kaplan returning from the back room, arms full of bread trays. He stopped mid-step when he spotted Admiral James, his eyes going wide. "Oh," he said awkwardly. "Didn't expect to see, sir. I mean, welcome." Admiral James offered a faint nod. "Morning." His voice held no edge, no expectation, but the respect it commanded was total. Mr. Kaplan all but dropped the bread into the kitchen and vanished without another word. Glenn scoffed, clearly agitated by the shift in dynamic. Still seated, James looked across the diner again. This time his gaze landed on Glenn's table. There was no accusation in it, just stillness. But Glenn's smile faltered anyway. Sarah returned to the counter, hoping she could make herself invisible again. But that wasn't possible, not anymore. Not after what had happened. And not with those eyes still tracking her from across the room like she mattered. She reached for the rag to wipe down the counter and caught her reflection in the napkin dispenser, flushed cheeks, red from shame and heat, and eyes she barely recognized anymore. How had it come to this? When had work turned from routine into survival? When had she started accepting this kind of treatment as normal? The Admiral's officer leaned forward slightly, whispering something. James gave the faintest shake of his head. Whatever had been said wasn't meant for action. Not yet. But something was coming. And deep down, Sarah could feel it. Have you ever witnessed a moment when someone's silent presence completely changed the energy in a room? What did it feel like? If this moment struck a chord with you, share your thoughts in the comments, or hit subscribe to follow the rest of Sarah's story. Sometimes the quietest people make the loudest impact. Admiral Robert James did not need to speak often to be heard. His silence carried weight, the kind of stillness that made others measure their words more carefully. From his booth near the window, he rested one elbow lightly on the edge of the table, gaze slowly sweeping the room with an ease that was anything but casual. His eyes didn't dart, they moved with precision, noting exits, shadows, tension in shoulders, the twitch of Glenn's restless leg beneath the table across the diner. It was a practice scan, the kind born from years of command and crisis. His officers remained still, their uniforms crisp and unbothered, but they were watching too. The younger one, Lieutenant Cole, looked ahead like his gaze was locked on nothing, but his ears were tuned to every word. The older of the two, Commander Ellis, shifted only when Sarah passed by the counter again, his brows tightening ever so slightly at the stiffness in her movements. They knew something was off, even if they hadn't witnessed the worst of it. And James, though calm as ever, was no longer observing idly. Sarah moved across the diner with forced grace, her hands steady but too steady, like they only stopped trembling if she focused every ounce of willpower on them. She balanced a fresh tray with plates for another table, eyes down, jaw clenched, lips pressed together as though if she opened her mouth, something might break loose. Her smile was mechanical, her posture too rigid for someone who'd worked this job for years. James watched the way she sidestepped Ty's boot, just narrowly avoiding a second trip. Her reaction had come too quickly, too practiced. This wasn't the first time they'd tried that. When she turned back to the coffee station, Glenn leaned across the aisle to say something low, and his fingers brushed the small of her back. It wasn't accidental. James's brow shifted by a fraction. Glenn's grin widened like it had scored a point, but Sarah didn't respond, not with words, not with expression. She only flinched slightly, just enough to be visible to the Admiral and no one else. James's jaw tightened, the muscle working beneath his skin for a brief moment before it stilled again. His gaze slid back to the table where the three men sat, laughing too loudly, posturing for each other. Rick was more restrained now, but the others leaned back in smug comfort like they owned the booth and everything in sight. The Admiral's eyes rested on Glenn's hand as it toyed with a spoon, then flicked toward Ty's elbow planted too far into the aisle. They weren't just being rude. They were probing for weakness. Sarah returned with 2 cups of water and laid them on the table behind the Admiral, apologizing quietly to the elderly couple seated there. James caught the motion from the corner of his eye, the stiffness in her shoulders as she straightened, the way she used her injured hand without complaint. A bright pink welt had started to form where the coffee urn had burned her earlier. She was hiding it, even now, trying not to show she was hurt. James didn't miss a thing. From his position in the booth, he studied her walk as she moved back toward Glenn's table. She was bracing herself. Her fingers tightened around the tray, and her steps faltered for just half a beat when Glenn shifted his legs into her path again. She didn't trip, but it was close, and Glenn laughed like it was a game. James leaned forward, slow and deliberate, and placed his cover gently on the table. The officers didn't speak, but both turned toward him in sync. He rose to his full height, slow as sunrise, with the kind of movement that demanded attention without asking for it. His shoulders squared, and his hands clasped gently behind his back. No flourish. No command. Just presence, the kind that whispered something unspoken had changed. The air in the diner shifted like a tide. A hush rippled outward from the booth. Glenn's laughter thinned. Ty glanced over, his expression flickering with unease. Even Sarah, halfway to the counter again, paused as though she could feel him standing. James took a step forward, then another, walking the long curve of the diner with unhurried control. His gaze never left Glenn's table, but he wasn't staring them down. He was studying them like a mechanic might inspect a faulty part. Rick's hand moved instinctively to hide the phone he'd been fidgeting with. Ty rubbed the back of his neck. Glenn just smiled wider, like he was trying to figure out the rules of a new game he hadn't agreed to play. The Admiral said nothing. He reached the edge of the counter and nodded once to Sarah, who looked startled but returned the gesture. Her voice was small when she asked, "Can I get you anything else, sir?" He didn't answer at first. He just looked at her, his eyes lingering not in judgment, but with a kind of quiet recognition. She was holding herself together with tape and thread, and he saw every seam. Behind him, the booth remained silent. Ellis hadn't moved. Cole kept his hands folded, posture perfect. But both of them had turned slightly in their seats, tracking the Admiral's every step like loyal shadows. Their restraint matched his own. Glenn cleared his throat as if to reclaim some attention. "Y'all military types always this serious?" he asked, too loud, forcing a laugh. "It's just a diner." Ty chuckled, but it sounded forced. Rick stayed silent. James didn't even look at them. He looked at Sarah again. Her cheeks flushed, and her jaw worked like she wanted to say something, but didn't know how. His eyes flicked to her hand. The burn had darkened. Still, she hadn't complained. She hadn't stopped moving. He turned to Glenn at last, just a glance, and tilted his head the faintest degree. Not a threat. Not a challenge. Just a weight behind the silence, heavy and unyielding. Glenn shifted in his seat, but held his smirk. Then James did the simplest, quietest thing in the room. He returned to his booth, picked up his cap, and set it down again. This time, he placed it on the table front-facing, centered. And then he stood. Sarah didn't hear the glass fall. She only heard the crash, the sudden clatter of ice and cola hitting the floor, splashing across her shoes and the leg of Glenn's booth. Her breath hitched before her mind caught up. Glenn leaned back in the booth with his arms stretched wide, smiling like a magician after a trick. "Oops," he said. "Someone's a little clumsy today." The diner froze. Forks hovered mid-bite. Someone coughed and quickly went silent. Sarah stared at the puddle for a moment, then down at her soaked shoes. Her apron was already stained with coffee from earlier. What was one more mess? She crouched, numb fingers gripping the rag from her waistband. Her knees pressed into the sticky floor, soaking through the fabric of her tights. The sugar syrup made her palms tacky, the scent of soda thick in her nose. Glenn leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the table, watching her like she was part of the entertainment. "Might want to double-check your footing next time," he said. She didn't answer. Didn't look up. Just kept wiping, dabbing at the mess like it would disappear if she moved fast enough. Her injured hand trembled, the burn on her palm smarting against the cloth. Ty chuckled, nudging Rick, who gave a faint nod, silent, but amused. Across the diner, the tension coiled tighter. The Admiral stood still, not stiff, just still, as though the entire room had become a battlefield, and he was deciding how to enter it. His cover sat quietly on the table. His officers didn't move. They didn't need to. Every eye in the room drifted toward him now. James took a step forward. Then another. No words, no rush, just gravity in motion. His boots met the tile with the softest sound, but it carried like thunder. Glenn didn't turn. Not yet. He was too busy smirking down at Sarah, who was now trying to wring the rag into an empty cup. James reached the edge of the booth, his shadow falling over the table like a curtain drawn tight. "That's enough, son." The words weren't loud. They didn't need to be. They carried the weight of command, of years of silence, of battles won and men shaped. Glenn froze. His grin faltered as he looked up, only to find Admiral Robert James standing over him. There was no anger in the Admiral's face. No raised brow, no sharpness. Just stillness, calm and absolute. Glenn blinked once, twice, and tried a laugh. "She's fine," he said, voice a little too loud. "Just a spill. Ain't nothing serious." He stopped mid-sentence when James didn't move. Didn't smile. Just waited. "You're embarrassing yourselves," James said, and this time the words were colder. Still even. But colder. Sarah felt the air change before she even looked up. Her hands stopped moving. Her breath caught in her throat like a thread pulled tight. She stayed kneeling, but slowly turned her head toward the voice that had cut through everything. James's eyes didn't leave Glenn's. A long silence followed. Rick's hands curled into fists in his lap, though he didn't speak. Ty shifted in his seat like he suddenly wasn't sure what to do with his legs. Glenn's tongue darted across his teeth, searching for the next joke, the next line that might reclaim control. But it never came. The game was over. James reached out slowly and rested a single hand on Glenn's shoulder. It wasn't aggressive. It wasn't a threat. But it landed like an anchor. Glenn stiffened. "You don't touch people like that here," James said, voice low but clear. "And you don't treat anyone like they're beneath you. Not in my town." Glenn swallowed, his smirk long gone. Behind them, the diner held its breath. A mother pulled her child a little closer in the corner booth. The man with the phone had started recording, quietly this time, phone angled low. Even Mr. Kaplan, halfway out the kitchen, stopped and said nothing. The only sound was the buzz of the overhead lights and the hum of the old refrigerator. Sarah rose slowly to her feet, still holding the rag. Her knees ached, and her fingers were stiff, but she stood tall. For the first time all morning, she wasn't shaking. The Admiral hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't made a scene. And yet, the entire room belonged to him. Rick stood suddenly. "We should go," he muttered. Ty nodded, pushing up from the booth, avoiding James's gaze. Glenn hesitated, pride flickering behind his eyes like dying embers. But James's hand didn't lift until Glenn shifted fully from his seat. Only then did the Admiral step back. The men left without another word. No threats. No curses. Just silence, broken only by the jingle of the diner door closing behind them. And when it did, the entire room exhaled. James turned to Sarah. "Are you hurt?" he asked. The question landed gently, almost private, even though everyone was still watching. Sarah opened her mouth, but nothing came out. She gave a tiny shake of her head, then whispered, "No, sir." He nodded once. He returned to his booth, calm as ever, and sat down again. His cover remained on the table untouched. His officers didn't speak, but both glanced at Sarah as she passed, just enough to offer something wordless and kind. Sarah returned to the counter like she was waking from a long sleep. Something had shifted. In her. In the diner. In everything. Have you ever witnessed someone use calm authority to stop something wrong without ever raising their voice? If Admiral James's quiet strength moved you, subscribe or leave a comment below. Your story might help someone find their voice when it matters most. For a long moment after the door shut, the diner remained suspended in silence. The kind of silence that hums after a storm, thick, stunned, and trembling with relief. Glenn's empty booth sat like an unmarked scar in the middle of the room, sticky soda pooling where his glass had fallen. Sarah stood motionless near the counter, the rag limp in her hand, eyes unfocused. She could still hear his voice echoing in her head, but it no longer carried weight. It was fading, shrinking into memory. Rick was the first to break. "We didn't mean anything by it," he said, voice small, his hand hovering near the door as if ready to bolt. Ty mumbled something about "just joking," avoiding everyone's gaze. Both men stood there, fumbling with words, their bravado dissolving in the wake of what had just happened. They looked to the other customers for validation. No one met their eyes. The two officers at Admiral James's booth rose with military precision. They didn't speak, didn't posture. They simply stepped into place, one near the door, one between the tables, forming a quiet wall that ended the conversation before it began. Rick froze mid-step, his excuses drying up instantly. Ty's throat worked as he swallowed hard, realizing this wasn't a place they could talk their way out of. Admiral James didn't rise again. He didn't need to. He only leaned back slightly in the booth, his hand resting near his cap, gaze steady and unblinking. Every second stretched. The two men shifted, torn between pride and self-preservation. Glenn's absence suddenly felt like a void they weren't strong enough to fill. Finally, Rick muttered, "We're going," his voice a low rasp. He reached for the door, and Ty followed close behind, glancing back once at Sarah, his eyes flickering with something like shame before he looked away. The bell jingled as they stepped out into the bright morning. The sound was sharp, final, like a line drawn through the moment. Then they were gone. A long, collective breath rolled through the diner. Someone whispered about time, but no one could tell who said it. The couple in the corner started to move again, clinking forks softly against their plates. The man with the phone lowered it completely now, ashamed to have even thought of filming. And Sarah, She just stood there, half aware, the world slowly coming back into focus. Her heartbeat was still too fast. Her throat felt raw. But as her eyes met Admiral James's across the room, something steadied. He hadn't moved since they left. His posture was as calm as ever, but there was something softer in his gaze now, something that felt like understanding without pity. She wanted to say thank you, to walk over and say the words properly. But her voice was buried somewhere deep beneath the weight of the morning. Her chest rose with a breath that shook, her body fighting between tears and composure. The choice was too heavy, so she did nothing, just met his eyes, hoping that would be enough. The Admiral broke the silence first. "Commander," he said quietly. The older officer at his side nodded once and stepped toward the counter, leaving a crisp $100 bill near the register. Sarah blinked at the money, confused, until she realized what it meant. Not payment for the meal, payment for dignity, restored in silence. "Sir," said the younger officer, "the men, they've learned enough," James replied. His voice was quiet but firm. The edge was gone now, replaced with something that almost sounded like weariness. "Let them walk. They'll remember it longer this way." Sarah turned away, pretending to tidy the counter. Her reflection stared back at her from the chrome napkin holder, flushed, shaken, but not small. Not anymore. Behind her, the sound of chairs moving and people whispering filled the room again, like the diner itself was exhaling relief it had been holding for too long. The bell above the door jingled one last time as the officers exited. Sunlight poured through the glass, cutting long lines of gold across the checkered floor. Admiral James stood last, his hand brushing the edge of the table as if anchoring himself to the moment. Then he placed his cover under his arm and turned toward the counter. His eyes found Sarah again. For a second, the world went quiet around them. Not awkward, not heavy, just quiet. He gave her a small nod, a gesture that said everything words couldn't. Gratitude, respect, understanding. She nodded back, her lips parting, but still no sound came out. He stepped toward the door, his movements slow and deliberate. Every step seemed to restore something intangible in the air, something the diner had lost long before today. People shifted as he passed, not out of fear, but reverence. He reached the door, paused, then looked back one final time. The faintest trace of a smile touched the corners of his mouth. When the door closed behind him, Sarah finally let go of the breath she'd been holding. Her hand came to her chest instinctively, feeling her heartbeat ease into rhythm again. The rag she'd been clutching dropped to the floor, forgotten. Mr. Kaplan emerged from the kitchen at last, eyes wide and uncertain. "You okay?" he asked softly. She nodded, even though she wasn't sure. Not yet. But something inside her had shifted, like a wound finally starting to heal from the inside out. Around her, people returned to their meals, conversation flowing quietly back into the space that had been filled with fear. It wasn't the same kind of quiet as before. It was peace. Sarah leaned against the counter, her legs weak beneath her. Her hand still stung where she'd burned it earlier, but the pain felt distant now, like a memory instead of a scar. She looked out the window toward the street, where Admiral James's reflection glimmered briefly in the glass before vanishing from view. Her lips curved into the faintest, almost disbelieving smile. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel invisible. The bell had barely stopped jingling when Sarah heard the boots again, measured steps returning toward the counter. She turned slowly, still unsure if her legs would carry her without folding beneath her. Admiral James stood a few feet away, cap now under his arm, gaze steady but softer than before. He didn't look like a man enforcing discipline anymore. He looked like someone asking a question that mattered. "Are you all right, Miss Miller?" The words landed gently low, respectful, and without expectation. Hearing her name spoken like that, from someone who had just changed the air in the room, almost undid her. Sarah opened her mouth, but no sound came. She swallowed, tried again, then gave a dry little laugh that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'm fine," she said quickly, too quickly. "Really, it's just been a long morning." She glanced at the coffee machine like it owed her backup. "I've had worse," she added, hoping that would be enough to dismiss it all. But James didn't budge. "You've been working on a burned hand," he said quietly, with no complaint and no help. His tone wasn't accusatory. It was observant, compassionate, but without pity. "I watched you walk through every part of this morning like it was normal." Sarah hesitated, then looked down at her palm. The burn was red and swollen now, the skin tight around the edge, still angry with heat. She hadn't even realized how bad it had gotten. "Yeah," she whispered. "I guess I'm used to it." James tilted his head, just slightly. "Used to what?" he asked. His voice was calm, but it urged honesty forward like a tide nudging a stranded boat. Sarah gave a small shrug and turned away, pretending to straighten napkin holders. But the silence he left in the space was too patient to ignore. She sighed, and it came out heavier than she meant. "My dad's a veteran," she said. "Was Navy, like you, retired early after an injury. He's got some medical issues. Been trying to cover the bills on my own for a while now." Her hands busied themselves with a cloth, but her voice stayed level. "I've picked up extra shifts, even covered for staff that quit. It's fine, really. I can handle it." James didn't interrupt. He let her finish. Then he nodded slowly, as if weighing every word before replying. "Sometimes handling it alone is the bravest and loneliest thing a person can do." Sarah froze, the cloth still in her hand, her breath catching in her throat. He hadn't said it like a compliment. He'd said it like someone who understood. For a second, they just stood there, two people surrounded by clinking dishes and low murmurs, but inside a much quieter conversation. She looked up finally, eyes glassy, but not crying. "Thanks," she said, voice barely more than a whisper. "For earlier, I mean." James gave a faint nod. "No thanks needed." He pulled a chair out from the nearest table and Saturday, "But I'll take a cup of coffee." "Black." He paused. "If you're still serving." Sarah blinked, then let out a breath that might have been the beginning of a laugh. "Always," she said, stepping behind the counter to pour a fresh cup. Her hands moved steadier now, like her body remembered what calm felt like. When she brought it to him, she noticed something tucked beneath the edge of the saucer. A crisp, folded bill. She shook her head, already trying to hand it back. "This is too much," she said. "I can't." James didn't take it. "Take care of your father," he said simply. "No one gets through this world alone. We all get help somewhere." Then he took a sip of the coffee and said nothing more. Sarah stood there for a second, staring at him like he might disappear if she looked away. She folded the bill slowly and tucked it into her apron, her hands steady for once. Around them, the diner moved again, customers murmuring, dishes clinking, pancakes flipping on the grill. But something in Sarah had shifted, quiet and deep, like someone had reset the rhythm of her life without touching a single thing. By the next morning, the whispers had already started. It began with a single customer retelling the moment Admiral James stood over Glenn, hand on his shoulder, not raising his voice, just silencing the whole room with his presence. By mid-afternoon, someone posted a summary on a local Facebook group, and within hours, the comments poured in. "Was anyone else there? Did you see it too?" He didn't even yell. The story became something more than what happened. It became what it meant. At Bayview Diner, things were quieter than usual that day, but it wasn't awkward. People looked Sarah in the eye when she brought their coffee. They smiled, offered thank yous that felt less routine and more intentional. Even the regulars, the ones who used to call her sweetheart without looking up, now said her name. It was a small thing, but it rang louder than yesterday's silence. Mr. Kaplan emerged from the kitchen mid-shift, wiping his hands on a towel and clearing his throat like he had something caught in it. "Sarah," he said, not meeting her eyes at first. "About yesterday. I should have come out sooner." He paused, then added, "I froze up." "That's not an excuse, it's just the truth." Sarah turned toward him, unsure of what to say. The man had owned the diner for over 20 years, always kind, but always distant, more comfortable behind the books than out on the floor. "It's okay," she said, though she wasn't sure she meant it. Mr. Kaplan shook his head. "No, it's not. I watched it happen, and I didn't do anything." He reached into the back pocket of his apron and pulled out a folded envelope. "This is for you," he said, handing it to her. "Consider it back rent for the last 2 weeks." And from now on, we're bumping your hourly rate. It's not charity. It's overdue. Sarah blinked at him, mouth slightly open, words caught somewhere behind her gratitude. Thank you, she said finally, voice soft. Mr. Kaplan gave a short nod, still not quite looking at her, then turned back toward the kitchen. But just before he vanished behind the swinging door, he paused. You handled yourself better than most would have. You shouldn't have had to. That evening, after her shift ended, Sarah packed a paper bag with her father's favorite lemon cookies and walked 3 blocks to the care facility. The halls were quiet, the smell of disinfectant familiar but not harsh. Her father, retired Chief Petty Officer Henry Miller, sat in his wheelchair by the window, reading an old tattered copy of naval history. His hands trembled more these days, and his mind came and went in waves, but today his eyes lit up when she entered. There's my girl, he said, smiling. She sat beside him, gently placing the bag on his tray. Brought you something sweet, she said, unwrapping the cookies. He took one with a grateful grunt, but didn't bite yet, just watched her with those pale blue eyes that had seen war, storms, and now her. Something happen? He asked, tone sharper than usual. Sarah hesitated, then nodded. She told him everything, not just the event, but the emotion, the burn on her hand, the weight in her chest. She told him about the Admiral, the silence, the moment she realized she wasn't alone. Her father's eyes glistened as she spoke, the cookie forgotten in his hand. Robert James, he asked after a long pause. Tall man, quiet? Served on the Saratoga back in '94? I think so, Sarah said. Her father leaned back, his expression distant but full of something more than memory. Hell of a man, he murmured. Didn't know he was still walking the streets with that much weight in his step. Then, after a long silence, he reached over and took her hand. I'm proud of you, he said, voice rough with feeling. Not just for standing through it, but for not letting it turn you bitter. Sarah swallowed the lump in her throat and leaned her head on his shoulder. Outside the window, the wind stirred the trees gently. Inside, something fragile and steady passed between them. The next morning, the paper landed on the diner's stoop just after dawn. Sarah didn't notice it at first. It was Mr. Kaplan who picked it up and set it on the counter. The headline wasn't flashy, just enough to make someone pause over their eggs and coffee. Admiral's quiet stand at Bayview Diner, and underneath, a moment of leadership, silence, and dignity in the face of cruelty. The article had quotes from witnesses, nothing grandiose, just honest. One man said, he never raised his voice, but I've never heard a room go so quiet. Another woman added, Sarah didn't cry, but I did watching her. There was a small photo of Admiral James leaving the diner, his cap under his arm, the sunlight catching on his medals. No dramatics. Just truth. Sarah stared at the photo for a long time. Her shift had just started, and the world was moving again, customers chatting, booths filling, orders stacking. But something inside her had settled. Not completely, but enough to stand straight. That afternoon, a woman came in with her teenage daughter and left a note folded beneath the tip. It read, "Thank you for staying kind. My daughter saw the video. You're someone I want her to look up to." Sarah tucked it into her apron pocket, pressing a hand over it like it might fly away. She didn't feel like a hero, but maybe that's exactly what heroes feel like. Have you ever seen kindness ripple through a community quietly, but powerfully? If Sarah's story inspired you, consider subscribing or sharing your own story in the comments. Sometimes one moment can change a life, but only if we make sure it's remembered. The idea came to Sarah late at night, long after the diner closed and the town had gone quiet. She sat by the window in her tiny apartment, a mug of tea growing cold beside her, and stared at the blank page in her lap. For a long time, she didn't know where to begin. What do you say to someone who changes your life with a few quiet words? So she started with the truth. Dear Admiral James, she wrote, her handwriting careful, pressed, and small. I don't know if you remember me. I was the waitress at Bayview Diner the day you stepped in. She paused, pen trembling, then added, of course, how could you not remember? I was the one on the floor with soda in her shoes and a burn on her hand. She smiled at her own sarcasm, but it faded quickly. She wrote about her father, about working double shifts, about the weight that had wrapped around her shoulders like a wet coat she couldn't take off. She didn't go into every detail. It wasn't a sob story, she reminded herself, but she let the honesty spill out in small, steady lines. She told him thank you, not just for stepping in, but for noticing, for seeing her when it felt like no one did. She ended the letter with a quiet hope that he was doing well, and that maybe, just maybe, he'd remember that day not for what he did, but for what it meant. Then she folded the page, tucked it into an envelope, and addressed it to the local naval base, not knowing if it would ever reach him. No return address. Just her initials in the corner. And a part of her that still didn't expect anything to come back. The week passed slowly. Customers at the diner still mentioned the article, still nodded at her like she was someone worth knowing. Mr. Kaplan framed the newspaper headline and hung it near the register, beside an old photo of the diner from the 1970s. Sarah didn't ask for it, but she didn't mind. She had grown used to the attention, not in a prideful way, but in a way that made her stand straighter. Every day after work, she'd check the small, dented mailbox outside her building. Most of it was junk, flyers, overdue bills, one coupon for a discount on tires. By Thursday, she'd nearly forgotten about the letter entirely. Then, on Friday afternoon, a thick envelope arrived, sealed with the Navy's insignia. Her hands trembled as she opened it. The first page was official, stamped and typed, with her name printed in bold at the top. It informed her that her father, Chief Petty Officer Henry Miller, retired, had been approved for expedited veterans medical assistance. The document outlined what services would be covered, which local clinics were included, and how to schedule follow-ups. It was clear, thorough, and more than anything real. She blinked several times, rereading each line just to make sure she hadn't misunderstood. Beneath the paperwork, folded once and tucked in neatly, was a small handwritten note on plain white stationery. The script was neat and slanted, written in black ink with the same precision he'd carried in his stance that day in the diner. It said, "Some debts are better paid forward than back. R.J." Sarah pressed the paper to her chest, unable to breathe for a moment. It was the simplest line she'd ever read, but it shattered something open inside her. She sat down slowly at the edge of her bed, the envelope still resting in her lap. Her mind reeled with the reality of it, not just the paperwork, but the gesture. He hadn't just seen her. He hadn't just intervened. He'd remembered. She told her father that evening. He was quiet for a long time after reading the letter, the pages trembling slightly in his hands. Then he looked up at her, pride shining behind his glassy eyes. "You know," he said, voice low, "back in the Navy, we used to say you can measure a man by what he does when nobody's clapping." Sarah nodded, smiling through the burn in her throat. The next few days brought something Sarah hadn't felt in a long time, lightness. Not because life had suddenly become easy, but because, for the first time in years, she wasn't carrying everything alone. Someone had stood beside her, even after walking away. She started walking differently, more upright, less guarded. The scar on her hand was healing now, pink and fading, a quiet reminder that she could be hurt and still keep going. She noticed the little things again, the warmth of a mug between her palms, the laughter of a toddler in the corner booth, the way sunlight stretched across the counter in the early morning. Small things. Important things. She began writing again in the quiet hours, sometimes for herself, sometimes for no one at all. She wrote memories of her mother's voice, stories her father used to tell about the ocean, and lists of things she'd one day like to do. She didn't know if Admiral James would ever walk through that diner door again. But now she didn't need him to. He had given her something better than rescue. He had given her permission. Permission to be seen. To be helped. To believe again in strength, in strangers, and most of all, in herself. 1 month later, Bayview Diner was busier than it had been in years. The bell above the door jingled like music, the booths filled faster than the coffee pots could keep up, and the clink of forks over eggs and pancakes became a constant rhythm. Locals came not just for the food, but for the story of the Admiral and the Waitress. Some came with curiosity, some with reverence, and a few just hoped to see her. They called her the Admiral's Waitress, as if she'd earned a badge instead of an apron. Sarah Miller didn't flinch under the attention anymore. She wore her name tag with pride and stood taller than she used to, her movements graceful and certain. The burn on her hand had faded to a pale memory, and so had the fear that used to linger just behind her smile. Now, when people spoke to her, they looked her in the eyes. And when she smiled back, it wasn't forced, it was earned. A new waitress named Holly had started the week before, barely 19 and nervous as a leaf in wind. She shadowed Sarah through morning shifts, jotting down orders with shaky hands and wide eyes. Sarah guided her patiently, teaching her how to balance 3 plates on one arm and how to calm a table with just the right tone. "They'll respect you more when you respect yourself," she said, remembering the days when that lesson was still foreign to her. Holly nodded every time like it was gospel. Mr. Kaplan didn't say much, but he watched with quiet satisfaction. He'd upgraded the diner's coffee machines and finally fixed the flickering bulb above booth 7. The framed newspaper clipping still hung behind the counter, slightly crooked, but proudly displayed. Tourists took photos in front of it, some asking if Admiral James ever came back. Sarah always said the same thing: he left something better behind. As for Glenn and his crew, they hadn't dared return. Mr. Kaplan made it clear after that day: disrespect wasn't just discouraged, it was a permanent ban. The local police didn't need to be called anymore, but they still drove by twice a day, just in case. Everyone in town knew what had happened. And more importantly, everyone knew what had changed. Sarah's father was doing better now, too. The medical assistance had come through, and with it, some breathing room, both financial and emotional. She still brought him lemon cookies on Sundays, and they'd sit by the window and read aloud, sometimes in silence, sometimes sharing stories. He always asked if Admiral James had returned, and Sarah would smile and shake her head. "He's done enough," she'd say. But part of her had wondered if he'd ever come back, even just once, even just to sit in the same booth and watch the world go by. The question lingered in her chest like a loose thread, never pulling, just resting there. Not because she needed rescuing again, but because people like that leave a mark. That Tuesday morning started like any other: soft sunlight, the scent of bacon and fresh coffee, and the soft jazz spinning from the vintage jukebox that someone had finally fixed. Sarah moved between tables like a current, correcting a wrong order, topping off mugs, nodding to the regulars. She passed Holly a fresh pot of coffee with a wink, then turned toward the window as something outside caught her eye. A man in a gray sweater and jeans walked slowly past, his posture unmistakably upright. He wasn't wearing his uniform. No ribbons. No medals. Just a plain civilian cap and a calm expression. But it was him. Admiral Robert James. He didn't come inside. He didn't need to. Sarah stood at the counter, her hand resting lightly on a tray, and watched him walk past. He glanced toward the window at just the right moment, as if he'd known she would be there. Their eyes met. She gave a small nod, nothing showy, just a gesture heavy with memory and meaning. And he returned it, just as subtly, just as steadily. Then he kept walking, disappearing past the bakery next door and out of sight. Holly appeared beside her, eyes curious. "Who was that?" she asked. Sarah turned to her and smiled. "A good man," she said. "A reminder." And with that, she picked up a fresh plate of pancakes and walked it to booth 4, her steps light, her shoulders back. Because not all heroes ride in on horses. Some walk in wearing white. Thank you for listening to this story until the very end. There's another interesting one on your left screen that I think you'll really enjoy.